We're very, very lucky today to have Luke Harding with us. And Luke I've known for a while. He's reported on controversy and conflict from all over the world for about 20 years, or more probably by now. In 2007, he moved to Russia and became The Guardian's Moscow bureau chief, resulting in his last three books, Collusion, How Russia Helped Trump Win the White House, Mafia State, How One Reporter Became an Enemy of the Brutal New Russia, and Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem, and Russia's Remaking of the West, two of which became New York Times #1 bestsellers. Yes. Thank you very much. Last year, he published Invasion, Russia's Bloody War and Ukraine's Fight for Survival, which is now out in paperback, and he will be signing it later. And it's just been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, which is rather amazing. Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Luke, you know, you've been doing this for quite a while in what is, the biggest conflict zone of the lot at the moment. How do you manage? Do you find it incredibly punishing?
Interesting. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you. Very delighted to be here at the festival. I mean, I've done a lot of war. I mean, for a while, I was the Guardian's war and death guy. That was the kind of, and I started off. I was in Delhi. I was in Berlin. I did the war in Afghanistan first time around, Iraq. I did some reporting from Syria. I did Russia's mini invasion of Georgia in 2008. And then in 2014, I mean, I've been going to Ukraine for about 15 years, since as you say, since I was in Moscow. 2014, I was there in the east of the country when Putin annexed Crimea and started a kind of pseudo uprising in Donetsk and Luhansk. And then I've been back. I mean, basically and briefly, when Russia sent sort of tanks, armored columns to Ukraine's borders in the autumn of 2021, I was in no doubt that this meant there was going to be a large-scale military operation, that this wasn't a bluff or a diplomatic maneuver. So I've been in Ukraine pretty solidly since then. I got back 2 weeks ago. I'm going again in about 10 days. And yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's grueling. It's exhausting. Kiev at the moment is being hit every night by Russian missiles, hypersonic missiles. And so you go to bed about 11, 12 o'clock, and then at 2 o'clock you wake up with this kind of ghostly wailing, which you can't sleep through. It's just enormously loud. And even if you could...
And the wailing is from the missiles?
No,
or
the
from
wailing
the
is this is the air
Sorry,
alarm.
yeah.
And you used to think, oh, well, I'll turn over, go back to sleep.
Yeah.
But then, of course, 15 minutes later, you hear explosions.
Yeah.
And I step out on the balcony, and Ukrainian air defenses are engaging. There is tracer fire in the sky. There are explosions. These days, they shoot most Russian missiles down, certainly in Kiev, not everywhere. And then you get an all clear about an hour later, but you have so much adrenaline in you, then you can't sleep, for another hour. And so you sleep about 5, and then you wake up and you repeat. And so, I mean, first and foremost, this is what Ukrainians endure. I mean, I come and go. I spent a long periods of reporting there. But it's grueling, and it's a form of deliberate collective terror by the Kremlin to wear down Ukrainians and to make them submit. So, I mean, one thing I think that helps is writing. I mean, I write my pieces for The Guardian. I wrote this book in between reporting stints last year. And, I would come back from Bucha, let's say. I was in Bucha in April of last year, just after the Russians wheeled out. And I was talking to the relatives of young men who'd been abducted by Russian soldiers, taken away and executed, shown cellars where they'd been held for days. And then a team of young Russians, came down the steps, made this guy, whose aunt I interviewed, Volodya, kneel and shot him in the back of the head. So I knew I was going to write this book on February the 24th, which was the day of the full-scale invasion, but I would come back from a month on the front line, exhausted, angry, tearful, my brain working very fast, and I would sit, and the next morning I would start writing. And I found it in some way kind of cathartic to tell the story of the invasion, but also to tell the story of Ukraine's kind of heroic fight back and the indomitability of Ukrainians there who won't surrender and will keep fighting.
Well, it's an incredibly moving book, and we already knew it was an incredibly moving story. But can we go back to anger? Because presumably, when
Yeah.
you were in Donetsk in 2014, and you could see all of this coming over the last few years, you must have been furious, like Zelensky, that the West was not waking up to it.
It's funny. I mean, this is quite a gloomy story, but my wife was sort of, when I was writing this book, was joking that I shouldn't call it invasion, Russia's bloody war in Ukraine's fight for survival. I should call it I fucking told you so.
Yeah.
Because I told you so.
Yeah.
I've written various books and about this. And obviously, when I was in Moscow, what was clear to me was that I arrived rather naively, having read Russian literature, and thought that this was a state that was moving slowly in a more kind of transparent direction. And in fact, I very quickly discovered the opposite was true, that it was already a sort of semi-authoritarian state that was getting darker and darker, that civil society was being snuffed out, that critics of Vladimir Putin were dying in mysterious and terrible ways. And also, I mean, I was joking about the KGB, but actually we had a series of break-ins at our Moscow apartment. I read about this in Mafia State. And these clumsy secret police officers from the FSB, the successor to the KGB, left various signs that they had kind of been there. So on one occasion, for example, they broke open the window when we were living on the 9th floor of a Moscow apartment block next to where my 6-year-old son was sleeping. So there was a 20-meter drop below. So we obviously double locked this window, and they had broken it open. So the implication being that maybe he might fall out. And we were told by the British Embassy in Moscow that our apartment was bugged by the secret police. And I sort of remember talking to the deputy ambassador saying, well, is there anything you could do about it? And to which the answer was no, but have a biscuit, because basically we're not a kind of great player these days. And we discovered we had video in the bedroom as well.
Yeah.
So, but the point about that is, so so what do? You kind of carry on and you laugh about it. But the point about that was that I had a kind of early insight into just how nasty and thuggish the Putin regime was already 10, 15 years ago, and was writing accordingly about kleptocracy, about Putin's wealth, about this sinister sort of project of kind of Great Russia, where Russia felt that it had what it called privileged interests in neighboring states. And I was accused on social media, often by Kremlin trolls, of being hysterical, of being an English spy with some literary ability. Apparently, was what one MP said. I was an English spy with some literary ability, which is kind of, I mean, do you take it or not? I mean, I don't know. There were a few of us. I mean, there was Ed Lucas, Oliver Bullough, Catherine Belton, but it felt quite lonely. And it was during a time politically where David Cameron, I mean, he was about 17 prime ministers ago, right? But you remember David Cameron, was trying to sort of reset relations with Russia. And we were saying, look, actually, that's not wise. Also writing about Russian money pouring into London. And finally, everyone has got the memo, but it's taken this terrible war for people to understand.
And it's interesting that, because I remember meeting a man who was the chief Sovietologist at the MOD, and he said that he spoke fluent Russian. He said he didn't really read intelligence reports. He just read Russian military journals, because there, he said, you could work out exactly what was going on. And his whole line was, you only had to, and you said this beautifully in the book, you only had to look at what Putin was doing, how he was building Vladimir statues in the Kremlin and everything else, to understand that really the modern Ukraine was a heresy as far as Putin was concerned.
Yeah, that's right. And Putin wrote this extraordinary essay, and we think he actually did write it. He had a very bad pandemic, as you know. I mean, the sort of defining image of Putin is a small man at one end of a very long table. And he seems to have read history books, and he came up with this pseudo essay basically saying that Russia and Ukraine were of common civilization. Ukraine was never a state. That
Kiev was an ancient capital.
Kiev was Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, but flowing from Kiev in the 10th century, Prince Volodymyr, as you say. And in a way, I talked to a emeritus Cambridge professor who said I would have given this it's a third-class piece of work. And we could laugh at it were it not for the fact that he is the leader of a major nuclear power, and it became have I gone again? No, it became a sort of predicate for war.
But wasn't it therefore staring at us in the face?
Well, I saw it, and some other people saw it. And actually, to be fair to the US and UK, whose record in intelligence has been kind of patchy over the
Yeah.
past couple of decades, they saw it too. And the Biden administration was warning everybody that this storm was coming. And curiously, I was in Kiev in the run up to the war. One of the people who didn't really want to hear this message was Zelensky, who has been brilliant and who I think has transformed into a kind of great wartime leader. I mean, I describe him as sort of Churchill with an iPhone. He's the only politician I have come across who can credibly talk into an iPhone and look kind of cool and actually get his message. I mean, imagine Rishi Sunak tried to do it. I mean, it would just be disastrous.
I was going to ask you, do you feel that the world would have responded as it has without Zelensky?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of describe Zelensky as his nation's kind of amplifier in chief. And the thing about him is not just that he's got all the skills that he took from being an actor and a comedian, which he's transferred to film, but generally there's a kind of honesty about what he says. Actually, when it's going badly, he will acknowledge that. He's
He's a very gifted campaigner, isn't he?
a gifted campaigner. I mean, and he's sort of he's very passionate. And also, one of the things I did in the book was I actually got to know his speechwriter very well.
Yeah.
Who's a modest guy called Dmitry Litvin, who when I saw him in Kiev, and basically he didn't want to see me. He didn't want to see any journalists, but one of my books, Mafia State, had been translated into Ukrainian, and he'd read it. It was on his bookshelf, and he decided he'd make an exception and meet me. And he just writes the most glorious lines. And some, he will write a speech. Zelensky will sit down at the iMac. He'll make a few little tweaks. But if you think about some of the lines when Zelensky was here, not his most recent trip, the one before, where he addressed MPs and peers in the Palace of Westminster. And Ukraine has been very keen to get warplanes. And he said, I'm about to go and see your king, King Charles, who trained as a pilot. And then he said, in Ukraine, every pilot is a king because they are so rare, they are so precious, they are so special. And you could feel this kind of roar go through the audience. There's no one else on the planet who quite speaks like that.
But not just his style. You said something terribly interesting here, I thought. It says Zelensky was all things to all people. Before the Greek parliament, he talked of Mariupol. Addressing Helsinki, he spoke of Molotov cocktails hurled during the 39-40 Winter War by brave Finns against Soviet invaders. Addressing Australia, Zelensky reminded his audience of MH17, the Malaysia Airlines plane shot down by Russia in 2014 above eastern Ukraine, in which 298 people died. To the Swedes, he cited the common colours of the national flags. I mean, this is very, very cunning campaign.
It's very clever. And what you have to understand, I don't know how many of you have read Seven to the People, where I mean, this is all a bit meta, where Zelensky plays a president of Ukraine. And obviously that he did that, and then of course he became the real president. So I mean, it was cosmically strange, but also kind
when
of
he
wonderful.
played the president, he played a slightly fumbling president.
Well, he played a kind of everyman teacher who becomes an accidental president. But bear in mind that this was in a country that was kind of shadow governed by oligarchs, and then we have this kind of universal figure. But that was the vehicle for his election success. But I think the substantive point is that what Zelensky has been very good at doing is saying, this is not our struggle. This is not a local conflict between two unhappy neighbors who can't get along. This is your struggle. This is everyone's struggle. Because if we go down, first of all, the Russians will keep going. And I do believe that. They would do Moldova next, the Baltics, they hate the Poles. Russian state TV talks about nuking London. I mean, they haven't mentioned Castle Hedingham yet, but it would be down the list somewhere. And essentially, their fight is for democracy, for decency, for self-determination, for the right to live in peace. And this is something we can all understand. And they've been brilliant at communicating that.
Yes, but equally, there is a point in the fact that up until now, the West have not got quite so close to Russia in terms of where they help with military and political support. And I suppose from a Russian perspective, now it must be absolutely terrifying, the idea of a Ukrainian NATO with such a long border with Russia.
Well, I mean, NATO was one of several pretexts for the kind of full-scale invasion, which actually was essentially an imperial, rather 19th century military action. But the Finns and now the Swedes have joined NATO, and Putin hasn't blinked. I mean, actually, that's a far more strategic threat to him if you think that NATO is a threat. But it was never really about NATO. It's about ultimately de-Ukrainizing Ukraine and turning Ukrainians back into good Russians as Putin sees them. He does not think that they're a nation or a people that they ever had sovereignty. And the absolutely brutal things that Russia is doing are sort of reflective of that. I mean, killing and executing civilians, raping women, abducting Ukrainian children, taking them back to Russia and then brainwashing them. I mean,
Yes,
that's
appalling.
why he's been charged by the International Criminal Court.
Yeah.
And it all flows from the idea that this is a lost province that he has to redeem.
And also, presumably, that he thought he could walk into with ease.
Well,
because
yeah.
one of the things you say, which
Yeah.
is so intriguing, that when this massive military column headed down towards Kiev from the original invasion, 30 people stopped it. 30 people on kind of quad bikes stopped the most. I mean, it was incredible. It's a change of warfare completely.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, the problem is the Russian troops had been told, they'd also been zombified,
Yeah.
that Ukrainians would welcome them with flowers.
Yeah.
And to begin with, they were genuinely bemused when mortars started raining down
Yeah.
upon them because
Plus, they didn't know until 48 hours before they were going
no,
in.
they
and
thought they
told
were,
they were just
on exercises, and what there are very many ironies, dark ironies about this conflict. One of them is that Putin considers himself to be a brilliant spy.
Yeah.
He thinks he is the greatest operative of the Cold and post-Cold War era, and yet he was being fed nonsense by his secret agencies because they were telling the dictator what he wanted to hear. I mean, he was suffering from sort of classic dictator syndrome, a bit like Stalin. And the expectation in Moscow was that Kiev would fall in a few days. I was in Kiev then, as the Russian tanks were coming, and I have to say the mood at the time was one of fear and dread.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of Ukrainians thought that Kiev would fall, too. But of course, Ukrainians are not Russians, and they fought back brilliantly and bravely. And Ukraine has survived as a sovereign state, but the problem is the price it is paying for that survival.
Yeah. The West weren't entirely unhelpful. I mean, Cameron was saying to me that they were providing snipers' rifles, all kinds of things, going back quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean that is true. And Boris Johnson, do you remember him?
Yep.
I mean, he is enormously popular in Ukraine. The one row disagreement I have with my Ukrainian friends is over Boris Johnson because. This audience may respect
Tony Blair's very big in Albania.
Tony Blair's big in Albania,
Yeah.
and there are little babies called Tony in
Yeah.
Albania, and little babies in Ukraine called Boris.
Yeah.
I would walk to downtown Kiev. I go past an art gallery, and there was a painting of Boris Johnson in the front of the art gallery, playing a lute, dressed as a Cossack warrior. I went to Kryvyi Rih, which is Zelensky's hometown, and bumped into a woman from Odessa painting a 40-foot Boris Johnson mural of him going like this. And I get in a taxi, and there's a Boris Johnson rap song, which has got this kind of dum 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 beat. You can Google it, Boris Johnson, and the chorus line is Boris Johnson going "Dobry dzień, everybody," which is like hello everybody in terrible accented Ukrainian. And he's an absolute cult figure, and my view, he's not been great here, but in Ukraine, the reason they revere him is because back in these dark days, he was talking about Ukrainian victory, where everybody, including the Americans, thought that Ukraine would go under.
Yeah.
And so he does deserve some credit for that.
Now, can we shift to the future? First of all, obviously, there is a counteroffensive happening as we speak. What's the end game?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. What I can tell you is that the war will continue this year. It will go into next year. My fear is it's going to be a long war, by which I would say 3, 4, 5 years. And the reason is simple. On the Ukrainian side, after Bucha and Mariupol, they know what Russian occupation means. So there are 4 million Ukrainians living under kind of tyranny, and they cannot trade land for peace. Firstly, because any president who signed a deal in Kiev would be swept away, but because so many people have been killed, so many young soldiers have died, so many women have lost their husbands, so many kids have lost their dads, so many parents have lost their children. The mood in Ukraine is absolutely vehement. They just want to kick the Russians out. So they can't stop. And also, were there to be a deal, they know that Putin would immediately violate it and then blame the Ukrainians. And Putin, for his part, he thinks he can still win this war. I mean, okay, it didn't go to plan, but he thinks that a long war suits Russia and that we in the West will eventually flake.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
he hopes
we'll
maybe
get
there'll be a
tired.
Republican
You
administration.
know, Trump will come back,
Yeah.
energy prices will respike, and there'll be kind of fatigue. I mean, I actually haven't noticed any fatigue. I mean, I do lots of literary events. There's always a big house. Sometimes Ukrainian refugees come, and I think people understand what's at stake, that this is really the great sort of civilizational struggle of our times, that this is, I would say, this is our 1930s moment. And what we're dealing with actually is Russian fascism. It looks like fascism, you know, from where I stand, having seen it close up. I mean, what they do when they come into a place, absolutely fascistic.
Very harrowing stuff.
And so you know, we have to stick with it. But Putin thinks that we won't. And that when Trump comes in, then Russia will be able to roll forward, take Kiev, kill Zelensky, and finish the job. And so the corollary of all that is it's going to be a long conflict.
And is it conceivable that they'll, in a way, that a Ukrainian breakthrough might change things? I mean, you've lived in Moscow. Can you see Putin suddenly, overnight, being defenestrated?
I can't. I mean, the problem, William, is that everyone has watched The Death of Stalin, right?
Yeah.
The Amanda Iannucci movie, and we all think, oh, it's got to be like The Death of Stalin. And unfortunately, you know, Amanda Iannucci, he's a genius, but it's not going to be his script. And Putin has had 23 years to consolidate power. It's gone from being, like I was saying, a sort of soft authoritarian state when I was there to being totalitarian. Less in common with the sort of Brezhnev late Soviet period and more in common with the Stalin era. All of the Russian journalists I used to work with, the independent ones, they've all fled. Some of them have been criminally charged with discrediting the Russian army. A lot of people I know have been murdered, actually. And any kind of dissent is impossible. You know, you hold up a banner against the war and you're taken away by the police, and that's 10 years in jail. So it's a very controlled society. It's a society where people watch state TV, they believe it. There is majority support for the war. There were lots. I mean, just finish. There were lots of rumors last year that maybe Putin was ill and would croak, but he's still there. And what I know from my sources, from kind of European intelligence agencies, that they say the one fact we have about Putin, which we're certain of, is that he has the best medical care in the world. You know, better than your plan and my plan, right? So essentially, we can't wait for him to fall over. And even if he were to fall over, probably his replacement, and I can tell you now, it will not be a woman. It'll be another man. Would have a similar kind of mindset. The only thing I can say, you know, to be a bit more kind of jocular, is the tradition in Russian succession is bald man, hairy man, bald man, hairy man. So it's not going to be Yevgeny Prigozhin. I don't know if people have come across him. He is the leader of the Wagner group, the mercenary outfit, and he looks like a Bond villain out of Central Casting. I mean, he's this enormous, bald guy who's shouting and ranting all the time. So it's not going to be Prigozhin. Probably hairy man.
I remember talking to Fiona Hill many years ago.
Yeah.
And she worked for Trump, but she's the Russian expert, and she's actually from Northern England, but has got dual nationality, and it's a very interesting woman. But her whole line was that Russia is kind of doomed for demographic reasons, and the demographic reasons have been sort of accelerated by this war, both in terms of losing young men to the front, but more importantly, perhaps, losing so many young people who've left the country. What do you think of that?
I mean, there's definitely something in that. I mean, Fiona and I did a panel at the Hay Festival a couple of weeks ago, and you're right, she's brilliant. I mean, a million Russians have left since the full-scale invasion, and these are the
cyber experts.
These are the cyber experts. These are entrepreneurs. These are kind of young university graduates. They've gone to Georgia. They've gone to Armenia. They've gone wherever they can. Some have gone to Turkey, wherever they can kind of get visas. I mean, there's been an outflow similar to what happened in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution, where white Russians left. Funnily enough, a lot of them left via Ukraine. They retreated, they went to Kiev, and then as the Red Army kind of pressed, I mean, this is actually all in Mikhail Bulgakov's The White Guard, which I mean, Bulgakov is a contentious figure in Ukraine, but I was reading The White Guard, set during this tumultuous period of 1917, 18, 19, in Kiev by Bulgakov, who grew up in Kiev. I was reading this as the invasion started and thinking about how history was repeating. And there's a whole kind of lot of emigres. Basically, the best Russians have got, by and large. I mean, some stay. The oligarchs are very quiet. But Putin has kind of complete control in a way that for a KGB guy must be thrilling, because that hasn't been true up until the last year or so. And Russia's own future is bleak. There's no prospect of democracy. There are demographic issues. But what Russia has, and Ukraine does not have, is it has strategic depth. It has millions of guys it can conscript. It is sending in basically uneducated boys from the villages to fight.
Very few come from Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Very few from Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
And from ethnic areas as well, from Buryatia and far-flung places like that. And on the Ukrainian side, it is the best people who are dying. It's the most educated, the most creative, poets, engineers, sports stars, novelists, musicians.
So does
They're
Ukraine
all being
have those
wiped out.
resources for 3-4 years
It
ahead?
does not.
No.
It does not. And this is the great tragedy. And each time I go back to Ukraine, I've got lots of Ukrainian friends. To begin with, they all knew someone in the army, and now they'll tell me of someone who died. And there are 24-year-olds from Kiev who are writing their wills before they go to the front. You see the most moving sort of funerals in Ukraine. I mean, I kind of tear up. I was driving out recently on my most recent trip, and a whole load of people had gathered by the roadside. And the cortege comes in of the fallen soldier, and everyone from the village kneels. So you get 80-year-old ladies holding the Ukrainian flag, kneeling and crossing themselves by the road as the cortege passes. I mean, it is so sad and terrible, but it's why we have to keep watching this story, and we have to think about it with compassion and with empathy.
But how can they, as a nation, sustain a conflict for another 3 or 4 years?
Well, with Western help. I mean, that's the point. We have to.
But we can provide the arms, maybe.
Well,
but they've got to provide the soldiers.
The thing is, that there are people, Ukrainians, who are willing to die. I mean, no one wants to die in this situation, but they're prepared to. They're not being coerced to. They're volunteering. The problem is the Western military strategy has been incrementalist. That Zelensky asked for tanks. We didn't do it for a year. He wants planes. They haven't arrived yet. And this counteroffensive, we don't quite know how it's working, but so far they haven't punched through. Very, very hard to go over minefields, through tank ditches where the Russians are entrenched. So we need to give them everything. The problem was I had an off-the-record conversation with someone, let's say, who was very, very senior in the British Army until recently. Basically, he ran it. And I was sort of saying, why did we only give 14 tanks? We've given 14 Challenger tanks. I said, that's not very many. And he said, well, we've only got 100. And half of them don't work, and the others are for training. And it turns out that global Britain doesn't actually have an army anymore.
No.
And I said, well, why don't we give artillery shells? Well, we don't make them. So unfortunately, we are weaker than we might imagine ourselves to be.
Well, definitely. And of course, the other thing is that all the different technologies they have, including Soviet weaponry, and I've heard people sort of trying to source old Soviet ammunition in South America to give to the Ukrainians for those particular kinds of weapons. Then they've got all the new Western weaponry, and each one presumably has got different ammunition or different needs.
But there are plenty of things we can do. I mean, a lot of people are hosting Ukrainian refugees, and that's absolutely wonderful. I'm sure in Suffolk and Essex as well. In fact, I know I've got friends who are doing it here. One thing you can do is just watch the news, or read the free Guardian live blog. Where we get 1 million clicks a day from all over the world. So just keep abreast of it. Donate money. I know people who drive cars out there. They'll raise money for a kind of Jeep, and they'll drive out the Jeep. So I think what's interesting about Ukraine is Russia is a very vertical society. I mean, when we had, to be trivial, or semi-trivial, when we had the Renaissance, they had the Mongols, right? It's always been a patriarchal society. It's always been very corrupt. Ukrainians, by contrast, are different. They had this Cossack tradition where they would elect their military leader back in the 16th or 17th century. I mean, it's a very horizontal, very networked society. It's quite anarchistic. It's really disputatious. I mean, Ukrainians argue all the time, but that means, you know, it's more plural than Russia. It's always been more democratic. It's always been freer, and now they're fighting to preserve that freedom.
I'm sure that one or two of you would like to ask a question. Yes, over there at the back. Duncan. Can we just wait for a microphone, just so everyone can hear? Thank you.
Can you say a few words about poor Mr. Navalny?
Sure. So, I mean, I know Alexei Navalny somewhat. I used to sort of see him in Moscow when he was then a lawyer and an anti-corruption activist, when he was a bit famous as opposed to kind of globally famous. He is brave. He is, well, I mean, this may sound trivial, but he's sort of physically, you know, he's tall and good looking, unlike the Kremlin, which is a consortium of very odd, strange, old, small men. And he is right. I mean, he's been saying forever that Putin is a crook. He's called Putin a kind of cowardly little man in a bunker, because it's true. Putin is terrifically cowardly, actually. And there are serious doubts as to whether footage of Putin on the front line in Ukraine is actually either filmed on the front line or actually Putin. Navalny kind of represents the hope for a better Russia. I mean, he was poisoned by the FSB, the same agency that killed Alexander Litvinenko, about whom I wrote a book, the same agency that broke into my apartment and bust open the window next to my son's bed. And he's tremendously courageous. And I think, you know, his decision to fly back after he got poisoned from Berlin following 6 months of treatment to Moscow, which led to his arrest, unsurprisingly, and to his incarceration, was one of, I mean, I can't think of anything braver, actually, this century, when he knew that was going to happen. And obviously, the Kremlin is determined to break him, to starve him, possibly to kill him. I mean, I don't rule out that he will die at some point in jail of you know, a heart attack. That's normally how it works. But he's there, and I think the chances of him becoming president of Russia democratizing, of him even being released, it's not going to happen while Putin is still alive, are very small. But a bit like the Decembrists who revolted against the Tsar in the 1820s and were exiled to Siberia, you know, you would hope that he is the harbinger of something better, but I fear that could be a long way off.
Yes, Edward. Yes. Hang on, Edward. Coming your way, microphone. There we go.
Hello, Luke. What is the what effect could Putin's mental health have upon the outcome of this war? I suppose what I'm getting about is, faced with defeat, could he push the button?
Yeah, really interesting question. And I remember talking to Yulia Tymoshenko, the former Ukrainian prime minister, about this. You know, is he mad? Is he bad? Is he sad? You know, what is going on? I mean, I would say, I think Putin is basically a psychopath, and which is why there's no point in trying to reason with him or negotiate it with, as indeed Emmanuel Macron tried to do in the run-up to the invasion, because he is in a sort of strange, unreachable, almost kind of messianic place where he's thinking about his role in history. And, you know, certainly Tymoshenko's view is that he's not mad and that he acts within his own kind of parameters, which are fantastical. You know, he thinks Ukraine is not a thing, that the Ukrainian government is being puppeted by the CIA and the Americans, you know, et cetera. I mean, that the West is incorrigibly decadent and depraved, probably including everyone in the audience. You know, I mean, he genuinely thinks that. But I think on the nuclear issue, what's holding him back is he doesn't care how many Ukrainians die, or indeed how many Russians die, but he's desperately concerned about his own physical survival and security. And his whole paranoia, I mean, he was the world's foremost social distancer during COVID. His whole paranoia about catching COVID was to do with his anxiety about being killed or dying. And his spy chiefs tell him every week they've foiled plots by the Americans to kill him. Now, this is not true, but he believes it. And so in that context, I think it's unlikely that he will use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine just because he fears the Americans would then kill him with a retaliatory strike. So that is what's holding him back, I think. But if I'm wrong, then you don't get your money back. Okay?
Yes. Gentleman at the front, and then Roger at the back. Thank you.
Fascinating talk. Great to see, when I was in Ukraine 7 years ago, young Ukrainians learning Ukrainian rather than Russian. But my question's about China. Does Putin realize how much of a risk China is to Russia? I mean, the Russian Far East is clearly an area that China thinks ought to be Chinese, underpopulated. Is he just really worried about Europe, about sort of the old Russian, the western part of the Russian Empire, and not concerned about the East and about the stands?
Yeah, a really interesting question. I mean, this is a kind of curious relationship, the kind of Chinese-Russian relationship. I did an event yesterday with Roger Cohen, the New York Times columnist at the British Library. He's actually just come back from Moscow. I was deported in 2011 and last summer put on an official blacklist with about 30 other people from the UK. So I can't go back. But he was the only American journalist there. Got back 2 days ago. He said that in Moscow, the hotels are now full of Chinese business people, delegations, entrepreneurs. In other words, all of the Europeans, all of the Western law firms, accountancy firms, chains that used to operate there, they've all gone. And the Chinese have kind of filled the void. But this is not a relationship of equals. I mean, Russia is very much a junior partner. And there's not even much kind of love there, I don't think. It's all about realpolitik and strategic need, where Russia is profoundly friendless. Its friends are Venezuela, Belarus, Syria, North Korea. And of course, the Chinese, I think, to some extent, are enjoying Russia's discomfort. I mean, they can see Russia is being chewed up. It's losing an awful lot of men. It's losing power. And so, yes, they do form an anti-Western, anti-American alliance. I can see that. But I think there's a degree of chauvinism from the Russian side. And I think the Far East, as you say, which in the 19th century was Chinese. I mean, if Putin can claim, Ukraine was proto-Russia in the 9th century and use that as a rationale for war, then the Chinese can say, well, these great territories are ours, and we will redeem them. So it's a dangerous game that Russia is playing. But for now, on the surface, it's love.
Over here, Roger.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I was particularly struck at the beginning. You were talking about your writing method. Did it take a lot of editing, the book? It sounds you were absolutely boiling when you got to the typewriter. And how do you know, is it difficult then to calm down and write a rational piece of prose?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of interesting question. I mean, I write books fast. That's my kind of magic power. If I have a magic power. I mean, I've done about 8 or 9 in the last sort of 11 or 12 years. And I don't think they're the worst. I don't think they're any worse for it. I mean, I don't think distance gives you greater objectivity. I think what gives you objectivity is being there. I mean, you actually need to be there. You need to be in Kherson. You need to be in Bucha. You need to be in Kiev. You need to be on the front line to hear the kind of whump of mortars, the percussive booms, and you need to tell the human story. I mean, I've spoken to an awful lot of people, and also you need to have kind of done the work. I mean, I speak Russian. I've spent 15 years covering this conflict. I know a lot of people at quite senior level, and it helps. And what I try to do in this book is sort of tell the macro and the micro. So yes, how our world has changed. The West has been rejuvenated to some extent. NATO certainly has got a boost. But also to tell human stories of people from Mariupol who disappeared in the inferno. And I still don't know whether they're alive or dead. I've tried to find out. And what I've done, I think, is a first draft of history. And I guess I feel I don't know if proud is the word, but I sort of feel it was necessary. I had to do it because there's this sort of, is it perhaps pedagogic, you could say, I just wanted to tell the story. I mean, it's a bit like the end of Hamlet, right? When there are bodies on the stage and, Polonius, it's just to tell the story so people understand what is at stake. And as I was saying, respond with compassion.
Well, I think we're very blessed to have your courage, and it can't be easy what you do. But because of what you do, we get to know about what's happening, and we should all be very grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, Luke Harding.
Thank you.